A landlord evicts a homeless man, but when he unmasks as Elon Musk, everything changes. Donald Grayson adjusted his expensive cufflinks as he stepped out of his luxury car, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The early morning sun reflected off the tall glass windows of his apartment complex, a high-end building meant for successful tenants who could afford the privilege of living there. Donald had spent years turning his properties into cash machines, filling them with the wealthy and ejecting anyone who couldn't keep up with his ever-rising rent demands. Today was no different. His phone buzzed as he checked the latest rent collections. One late payment. His jaw clenched. He had zero tolerance for freeloaders. People who couldn't pay on time weren't his problem. They needed to learn responsibility or find another place to live. As he approached the entrance, a small crowd of tenants stood whispering. Donald frowned. Something was off. He followed their gazes and spotted the problem immediately. A disheveled man sat on the sidewalk, leaning against a cardboard box, his few belongings scattered around him. His jeans were worn, his jacket slightly tattered, but he didn't have the usual defeated look of most vagrants. Instead, he looked calm, relaxed, even content. Donald's lip curled in disgust. He marched forward, his voice sharp. "Hey, you can't sit here." The man looked up, blinking as if Donald had pulled him from deep thought. "Oh," he said, his voice smooth and casual. "Why not?" Donald scoffed. "Because this is my building. And you're scaring off my tenants?" The man chuckled. "I don't think they're scared. They look curious." Donald turned to see that the tenants had, in fact, stopped whispering. Some were watching him, waiting to see how he'd handle this. His grip on his phone tightened. He hated being tested. "Move along," Donald ordered, his tone colder. "There are shelters for people like you." The man studied him, then slowly stood, stretching as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't weak or frail, the way Donald expected homeless men to be. He had an odd confidence about him, something almost unsettling. "You assume a lot," the man said, brushing off his jacket. Donald raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? Like what?" The man smiled slightly. "That I'm homeless." Donald rolled his eyes. "Oh, excuse me. You're just sitting on the street with all your belongings in a pile." "My mistake." The man gave a small shrug. "Maybe your mistake is assuming people are only worth what they own." Something about the way he said it made Donald hesitate. But he quickly pushed the feeling aside. He had dealt with plenty of lowlifes before. This was no different. "I don't have time for riddles," Donald snapped. "I'll call security." The man simply tilted his head. "Do what you need to do." Donald scowled and turned on his heel, pulling out his phone. He was about to dial when one of his tenants, a young woman named Rachel, stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. Grayson?" she said cautiously. Donald exhaled sharply. "What?" Rachel hesitated. Maybe he's not hurting anyone?" Donald narrowed his eyes. "Do you pay me rent on time every month?" Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but..." "Then let me handle this," Donald snapped. Rachel frowned, looking like she wanted to say more, but she fell silent. Donald turned back to the man. "You have 5 seconds to leave." The man simply smiled. "See you around." And just like that, he grabbed his bags and walked away. Donald shook his head, muttering under his breath as he made his way inside the building. People these days, so soft. But something about the man's unbothered attitude lingered in his mind longer than he cared to admit. The next morning, Donald arrived at his office, feeling good. He had a meeting with investors later in the day, and his properties were performing well. Another successful month. As he sat at his desk, his assistant knocked hesitantly and stepped in. "Sir, we have a problem." Donald barely looked up. "What is it?" The assistant swallowed nervously. "The bank called. Your accounts are frozen." Donald froze mid-sip of his coffee. Slowly, he lowered the cup. "What?" "They're investigating some irregularities," she said. "Apparently, someone placed a hold on all transactions involving your properties." Donald's stomach twisted. "Who?" The assistant looked paler than before. "Sir, it's SpaceX." Donald blinked, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. "SpaceX? The rocket company?" She nodded. "And Tesla? And Neuralink?" and several other major firms. They're involved in a full-scale financial review of all your assets. Donald's pulse spiked. None of this made sense. How the hell had he ended up in a SpaceX investigation? He shot up from his chair. Get me my lawyer. No. The assistant scurried away, leaving Donald gripping the edge of his desk, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. And then, his phone rang. The number was unknown. He hesitated, then picked up. Who is this? A familiar, calm voice spoke. I told you we'd see each other again. Donald's breath caught in his throat. The homeless man. Except now, the casual tone carried something else. A quiet authority that made Donald's skin crawl. You evicted me from your sidewalk, the man said, sounding amused. So, I thought I'd return the favor. Donald's mouth went dry. Elon Musk, the voice confirmed. Donald felt like the floor had dropped out beneath him. The blood drained from his face. His knees nearly buckled. Why are you doing this? Donald stammered. Elon chuckled. I wasn't planning to. I was just visiting one of my properties. You know, the one you think you own. Donald's breathing stopped. Oh, Elon added casually, did I forget to mention? I bought it. Yesterday. Donald's entire world collapsed. Every tenant, every piece of real estate he had built his empire on, was no longer his. No, Donald whispered. You're lying. I never lie about business, Elon said. Unlike you. Donald sank into his chair, his body feeling numb. You can't just take everything. Elon exhaled through the phone. Donald, you spent your whole life stepping on people. Thinking money makes you better. But here's the thing. Money doesn't make you powerful. It only reveals who you really are. And I don't do business with men like you. Donald's fingers trembled. I can fix this. You can pack your things, Elon interrupted. Because your time as a landlord is over? The line went dead. Donald stared at his phone, then at the papers on his desk, his vision blurring. Outside his office window, the city skyline stretched before him, but it no longer belonged to him. The game was over. And Elon Musk had won. Donald sat frozen in his chair, gripping the edges of his desk so hard that his knuckles turned white. His mind refused to accept what had just happened. It couldn't be real. His entire empire, built on decades of ruthless business tactics, had crumbled in less than 24 hours. Elon Musk, the so-called homeless man he had kicked off his sidewalk, had bought his entire building. And not just his building. Donald's entire portfolio of properties was under review. His financial accounts were frozen. His tenants were now answering to someone else. His phone buzzed again. His lawyer. Donald snatched it up. Tell me you have good news, he growled. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, in a carefully measured voice, his lawyer, Victor, sighed. Donald, we have a problem. No, Victor. I have a problem. You have a job. Fix this? Victor hesitated. That's the thing. There's no fixing this. Musk didn't just buy your building. He bought out the holding companies that own your properties. And those holding companies were sitting on a mountain of debt that he now controls. Donald felt the blood drain from his face. What do you mean? Victor inhaled slowly. I mean you don't own anything anymore. Everything has been acquired or liquidated through leveraged buyouts. And since Musk technically owns your debt, he can call it in immediately. Donald shot up from his chair, his voice rising. This is illegal. This is corporate warfare. I'll sue. Victor's voice remained neutral. You could try. But legally? There's nothing to sue for. Everything was done above board. Musk's team had been preparing this for weeks. He didn't just wake up and decide to do this, Donald. He baited you. And you walked right into it? Donald staggered backward, gripping the edge of his desk. I don't understand. Victor let out another sigh. Donald, the second you kicked that man off your sidewalk, you sealed your fate. Musk didn't do this out of spite. He did it to prove a point? Donald's breathing grew erratic. So what? I just lose everything? Victor hesitated. Well, technically no. Donald clutched onto that sliver of hope. What do you mean? Victor cleared his throat. Musk left you an offer. Donald narrowed his eyes. What kind of offer? Victor exhaled. He wants to meet you. In person. Donald's jaw clenched. Every instinct told him this was a trap. But what choice did he have? He had to face the man who had just ripped his world apart. 2 hours later, Donald arrived at Tesla headquarters. He was greeted at the entrance and escorted through sleek, futuristic hallways lined with cutting-edge technology, things that felt alien to a man whose fortune had been built on rental agreements and eviction notices. The door to the conference room opened. Elon Musk was seated at the far end of a long table, dressed casually as ever, scrolling through something on his phone. He barely looked up as Donald stepped inside. Have a seat, Elon said, tapping on his screen a few more times before finally glancing up. Donald sat stiffly, his shoulders squared. You win. Is that what you wanted to hear? Elon smirked. Not quite. Donald's patience was wearing thin. Then why the hell am I here? Elon leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. I wanted to see something. Donald frowned. See what? Elon studied him for a long moment. Then, finally he said, whether you're capable of change. Donald blinked. That was the last thing he had expected. Change? He scoffed. You're joking, right? You've ruined me. My business, my reputation. Elon cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. Your business was built on greed. You had no problem throwing people out of their homes, jacking up rent, exploiting anyone you could. He leaned forward slightly. You don't care about people. Just profits? Donald exhaled sharply. That's how the world works. Elon raised an eyebrow. Is it? Donald scowled. Don't act like you're some saint, Musk. You're a billionaire too. You didn't get here by playing nice. Elon chuckled. You're right. I didn't. But there's a difference between building something and stealing from people. Donald clenched his fists. So what? This is a morality lesson? You want me to apologize? Beg for my buildings back? Elon shook his head. No. I want you to listen. Donald hesitated. For the first time in his life, he felt uncertain. Elon tapped on his phone and slid it across the table. A video began playing. It was a montage of Donald's evictions. Footage of families forced out of their apartments. Mothers crying as they packed their things. A man begging for more time. Children standing in doorways, confused and afraid. One clip in particular showed Donald himself arrogantly telling a single mother, if you can't afford it, then leave. Simple as that. Donald swallowed hard. Elon's voice was softer now. I don't expect you to feel guilty. I don't even expect you to care. But I want you to understand one thing. Your actions have consequences. Donald looked away, his throat tightening. Elon continued. I don't need your money. I don't need revenge. I wanted you to feel what it's like to be powerless. He leaned back, watching Donald's expression shift. Because that's what you did to people for years. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Donald muttered, so, what happens now? Elon studied him for a moment. Then, to Donald's surprise, he slid a contract across the table. Donald hesitated before picking it up. As he scanned the document, his eyes widened. It was an offer. A job. Not as a CEO. Not as a landlord. But as a consultant for affordable housing initiatives. Donald looked up in disbelief. You want me to work for you? Elon nodded. You understand real estate. You understand how to run properties efficiently. But now, you'll do it for something bigger than yourself. Donald shook his head. Why would you give me this chance? Elon smiled slightly. Because everyone deserves one. Donald stared at the contract. His old life was gone. His empire was dust. But maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. With a deep breath, he picked up the pen and signed. Donald stared at the contract, his fingers still gripping the pen as if his entire world had just shifted beneath him. He had spent his whole life accumulating wealth, building an empire on the backs of struggling tenants, convincing himself that success was defined by profit margins and power. And now, the man who had destroyed his empire in a matter of hours was offering him something unexpected. Not revenge, not punishment, but a second chance. His throat was dry as he finally spoke. Why? Elon leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Because change is possible. If you're willing, Donald scoffed, shaking his head. You expect me to believe this isn't some game to you? Some way to humiliate me further? Elon shrugged. I don't waste time on people who aren't worth it. The words stung more than they should have. Donald had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable, that power meant controlling others. Now, sitting across from Musk, he felt small. He exhaled sharply, pushing the contract away. And if I say no? Elon smiled slightly, as if he had expected the response. Then you walk out of here with nothing? He gestured toward the glass walls overlooking the city skyline. Your name will be wiped from real estate history. No one will remember you as a great businessman, just another cautionary tale about greed. Donald swallowed hard. I don't need you, Elon continued. But this is your one shot to be something other than a villain in people's stories. Donald clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to lash out, to call Musk arrogant. But the truth was, Elon didn't need to gloat. He had already won. The real question was whether Donald was willing to stop losing. He looked down at the contract again, the words almost taunting him. Consultant for affordable housing initiatives. A complete pivot from everything he had ever done. But if he didn't take this, what was left? With a slow, reluctant breath, he pulled the contract back toward him and signed. The moment the pen left the paper, it felt final. A lifetime of ruthless business tactics, of evictions, of climbing the corporate ladder at any cost, gone. Elon watched him for a long moment before nodding. Smart choice. Donald exhaled and set the pen down. What now? Elon stood, extending a hand. Now, you learn what it's like to build something that matters. Donald hesitated, then shook his hand. It was the first time in years he felt like he wasn't gripping onto power, but letting something go. A month later, Donald stood outside a construction site in a part of the city he had never bothered to visit before. It was a low-income housing project, part of a new initiative Elon was funding to provide affordable, sustainable homes for struggling families. And Donald was in charge of making sure it ran efficiently. At first, the transition had been jarring. No more suits, no more multimillion-dollar meetings, no more corporate power plays. Now, his days were spent talking to architects, sitting in planning meetings, actually listening to people instead of dismissing them. And for the first time, he saw the real cost of his past actions. Families who had been priced out of their homes. Elderly tenants who had been forced onto the streets. He had spent decades ignoring them. Now, he was working for them. And oddly enough, it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a purpose. One afternoon, as he reviewed the project's latest updates, he spotted someone familiar approaching from a distance. Elon Musk, dressed casually as always, walking toward him with that same calm, unreadable expression. Donald wiped the sweat from his brow and straightened. Didn't think I'd see you here. Elon glanced around. Had to check in. Wanted to see if you've run off yet? Donald smirked. Haven't had the urge. Elon nodded, then studied him for a long moment. How's it feel? Donald looked around at the site, at the people actually working toward something, at the buildings rising from the ground not as cash cows, but as homes. I don't know yet, he admitted. Different? Elon smirked. That's a start. A beat of silence passed between them. Donald hesitated before finally asking the question that had been weighing on him since this all began. Why me? Elon tilted his head. What do you mean? You could have buried me. Left me with nothing. You could have let me be remembered as a failure, a crook, a heartless businessman. He exhaled. But you didn't. Elon was quiet for a moment before responding. Because people like you don't usually get a second chance, he said simply. And because most of the time, they don't take it. Donald frowned. And what if I screw this up? Elon's lips twitched into a slight smirk. Then I'll be back. Donald chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I don't doubt that. Elon nodded toward the site. Keep building. And with that, he turned and walked away. Donald watched him go, then turned back to the construction site, his mind clearer than it had been in years. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing power. He was building something real. And for once, that was enough. Donald stood at the edge of the construction site. watching workers lay the foundation of what would soon become affordable housing units, a concept he had once scoffed at. The past month had been the longest and most humbling of his life. Gone were the days of luxury offices, high-stakes meetings, and ruthless eviction notices. Now, his daily routine involved reviewing blueprints, talking to tenants, and, ironically, fixing the problems created by landlords just like his former self. And yet, instead of feeling bitter, he felt something unexpected. Purpose. For years, he had measured his success in dollars, properties, and control. Now, he saw things through a different lens. How many families could afford to stay in their homes? How many kids would grow up without the fear of eviction? How many lives would improve because of decisions he made? He never thought it would feel like this. He never thought it would feel right. Mr. Grayson? Donald turned to see a young woman approaching, one of the project managers, Stephanie. She carried a clipboard and looked slightly nervous, which was still something he was getting used to. People weren't afraid of him anymore. Yes, he asked. There's a family here. They just moved into one of the first completed units, and they asked to meet you. Donald raised an eyebrow. Me? Stephanie nodded. I think they want to thank you. Donald hesitated. He wasn't used to being thanked. In his old life, people either feared him or resented him. There was never any gratitude. He nodded slowly. All right, take me to them. The small apartment complex was modest but well-built, modern, energy efficient, and, most importantly, affordable. The kind of place that would have been impossible under his old business model. Stephanie led him to one of the units, where a woman stood outside with her young daughter, holding a small potted plant. The woman, Rosa, smiled nervously as Donald approached. You're Mr. Grayson, right? Donald nodded. I am. Rosa exchanged a look with her daughter, who shyly clutched her mother's leg. We just moved in last week. I heard you were one of the people who helped make this possible. Donald wasn't sure how to respond. I used to live in one of your old apartments, Rosa continued, her voice soft. Donald's heart skipped a beat. She noticed his expression and gave a small, sad smile. Yeah. You probably don't remember, but you evicted us last year. Donald swallowed hard. We were late on rent. Not by much, just a little. I had lost my job, and I was waiting for a new one to start. But there were no extensions, no second chances. Her voice wasn't angry. She wasn't accusing him. She was just stating the facts. Facts that he had never bothered to think about before. I spent months living in my car with my daughter, Rosa said, trying to save up, trying to find a place that wouldn't turn me away just because I had an eviction on my record. Donald felt a deep, sinking weight in his chest. He had evicted so many people over the years. He had never once looked back. Until now. But then I heard about this place, Rosa said, glancing up at the building. And it was affordable. And it didn't require a perfect rental history. And she took a deep breath, her eyes misting. And now we have a home again. Donald's throat tightened. The little girl, maybe 5 or 6, stepped forward, still holding onto her mother's leg. She hesitated before reaching out and handing him the small potted plant. For you, she said softly. Donald stared at it, speechless. It was a tiny thing, just a simple green sprout in fresh soil. But something about it made his chest ache. Rosa smiled. We just wanted to say thank you. Donald looked at her, at this woman he had once thrown out onto the street. And now, somehow, she was thanking him. His fingers tightened around the pot as he swallowed the lump in his throat. But I don't deserve this. Rosa gave him a knowing look. Maybe not yet, but maybe someday you will. Donald nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if he'd ever fully make up for the things he had done. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to try. Later that night, Donald sat alone in his apartment, staring at the small plant on his kitchen counter. It was the first thing he owned that wasn't about power, money, or control. Just growth. His phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Elon Musk. Heard you met Rosa. What did you learn? Donald stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. Donald. That I should have listened sooner. There was a long pause before Musk's reply came through. Elon Musk. Now don't stop. Donald set his phone down, exhaling deeply. He wasn't that man anymore. and tomorrow he'd wake up and prove it. The end.